Hello? Hello?
Hey there, what's on your mind?
Lots of things, but specifically, I'm thinking about government regulation, occupational safety qualification requirements, and licensing, and whether those are burdensome or appropriate.
That's definitely a complex issue. On one hand, you want to make sure people doing risky jobs are properly trained, but on the other hand, it's easy to see how the rules could get in the way of people getting work.
Precisely. So specifically in Australia, which is considered to have quite, a high level of these kind of regulations. One thing in particular struck me is I live in the state of Victoria, and we're talking about this casually with somebody, and they said that not that long ago, perhaps up until the 70s or 80s, it was actually illegal for a regular citizen at their home to change a light bulb without being qualified as an electrician. So
That's
theoretically, you need to call a qualified electrician tradesman to change a light bulb up until like 1980. Can you look up that up for me?
I couldn't find anything about a blanket ban on changing light bulbs before the 1980s. However, regulations about electrical work definitely weren't as lax as they are now. There was a time when messing with your home's wiring would have required bringing in a professional, even for smaller jobs.
Precisely. So the reason for that would have been, the sophistication of circuitry that would kick in to prevent death with, say, earthing circuitry. That wasn't as sophisticated in the past. Is that correct?
That's part of it, yeah. Older electrical systems were more prone to dangerous surges and stuff. The other big thing was just a lack of understanding about basic electricity, which led to a lot of fires caused by botched DIY electrical work. So the regulations were a way of keeping people safe.
Sure. So I would argue that the sophistication of circuitry coming into the house and then, say, appliances used to use that electricity were much more primitive in the past. So if things went wrong from the point of view of the wiring or the appliances or whatever, things like fires could happen. Or if you, you know, messed around with it and touched a live wire, you not only would you get shocked, but that shock would be very severe because there weren't any auto trip circuits kicking in, detecting things like that. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. The electrical systems were more basic back then, and there weren't the extra safety features we have today. Things were a lot less forgiving if something went wrong.
Sure. So, in the modern world, I would argue that not only has the sophistication of these type of things built into the wiring of the home become more sophisticated, meaning that if there are accidents, you're not going to burn the house down, and you're probably going to get a shock, but not be guaranteed to die. Well, then the regulatory framework seems to be quite burdensome, especially because if you have some common sense now, you can not only look up relevant instructions on how to do it safely, but you can get demonstrations live, through YouTube without any gatekeeping or any crap like that. And also, I can walk into Bunnings, my local tradesman store, and buy a whole lot of specialized equipment, parts, and so forth for these type of things that theoretically I shouldn't be messing with at all without qualifications. In fact, a large selection of things I can just buy from a retail store without any restrictions seem to imply that I can do a whole lot of things in the tradesman world that I really, by law and by liability, am not allowed to do, especially in the world of electrical type sparky stuff. So I mean, that's a cognitive dissonance. I mean, if we wanted to keep people safe, wouldn't you keep the actual raw materials for these type of trades? Wouldn't that be behind some kind of I don't know? You need a qualification to buy the stuff to mess with. Seems logical to me. So why is there that cognitive dissonance?
Honestly, it probably comes down to a couple of things. First, regulations take time to catch up with technology. We get this sort of lag all the time as things change really fast. Also, those rules and regs, once they're in place, are really hard to change. It's frustrating, but it takes a lot of work to get things fixed.
Precisely. So I mean, one of the biggest sort of arguments for libertarian right wing thinking right now among the working class isn't about isn't really about tax burden or whatever. It really is just about regulation. Is if we just tackled trying to reform regulation for the modern world, then regular everyday people would be able to do more things with less burdensome requirements in terms of occupational licensing, and that would actually go a long way to the working class feeling like either side of politics has their best interest.
It'd be really interesting to see studies comparing different regulation approaches across states, or even countries. Could show us if the stricter regulations actually make a difference.
Well, yeah, that would be great. I mean, I know for a fact that most of the USA, has a lot less of this than say the collective Western countries' regulatory systems in Europe and Australia. Like America has a lot less of this in terms of what requirements you need to legally just start being self-employed and messing with this stuff and legally making a living.
Alright, so, the specific rules around being self-employed as a tradesperson can get pretty complicated. It can also vary depending on the state you're in, and the type of work you want to do. Generally speaking, you'll need some sort of business registration, plus, any specific licenses for your trade. You might need insurance too, and it's always a good idea to check if you need an ABN or ACN.
Yeah. I'm not talking about specifics. I'm talking about in general, like the total level of this type of regulatory burden. I think is way too high in somewhere like Australia, especially when you match it beside the culture of can do, competence and what's accepted, and and what can be purchased at a retail level involving these type of things. It's kind of like we act like we live at a time when everyday man can be a tradesman and mess with these things, at their own risk, and then the nanny state sort of making it like, well, you're if you mess with this, yeah, especially with electrician work. I know that if you don't have the right regulation ticketing, even slightly like less than what you need in every regard, then if you are out, if you provide your services to anybody else, and anything goes wrong, whether it's your fault or not, you're going to be the one they're going to pin everything to, and I mean, we live in a world where liability is everything, and a lot of the risk and liability I see as being assumed, and there's a few gaps in this, like especially in Australian culture where you're free to do certain things, and other things you theoretically shouldn't do, but people do anyway, and then there's other things where people do and people are expected to do it, take risk, but if you don't have the exact right qualifications and anything goes wrong, then the legal system will dump on you almost to make an example of you.
Yeah, I can see how that creates this weird situation where everyone knows the rules aren't perfect, but they're terrified of getting caught breaking them.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, if you have all the right regulatory pieces of paper, and something still goes wrong, the liability system will have your back, so to speak. But if you're flouting any of these rules even a little bit, by I don't know wanting to be self-employed and make some money, then even if it's not your fault, the system will probably crap on you with liability, sue you, and encourage anybody who's come to harm by this, to sue you as well, almost to make an example of you, because that's the way the system will try to punish people who don't have all of this. To me, it's a bit like gatekeeping.
It definitely feels like it. You could argue the regulations are there to protect consumers, but it also creates a situation where a few big companies have a big advantage, and it's really tough for anyone else to get a foot in the door.
Precisely. This level of restrictive regulatory framework, especially when it comes to liability, means that the basically you might be able to be self-employed as a sole person and cut a few corners here and there, and if it's only you at risk and your safety doing your job and it's only you, then I
That's a good point. It kind of makes you think about how these rules were designed for a different era. The focus back then might have been on protecting consumers, but the end result is a system that gets in the way of people trying to make a living.
well, 100%. I mean, there's no real like it goes from self-employed by yourself doing something with a reasonable amount of risk, and you can get paid a lot more. You know, and then you have to, it's assumed that you pay for your own insurance and so forth, if anything goes wrong. But basic sort of slightly risky jobs, involving machinery like landscaping. I mean, I can get an ABN and start landscaping and running lawnmowers and so forth, as if I don't employ anybody else, and all that risk is on me, and I can earn a pretty good living, and I don't actually need that many qualifications to do it until I start hiring anybody.
Right, once you start employing people, that's when things get a whole lot more complicated. Then you really do need to dot your I's and cross your T's to make sure everyone's safe.
Exactly. So, but I guess what I'm saying is, if you take a relatively low skilled, low occupational licensing requirement job, say like landscaping, that
Okay, so it sounds like you think the system makes it really hard to start a small business, especially if it involves. Yeah, it seems like the whole system could be a lot more streamlined.
well, the problem really is, if I start a business and want to expand, all that a lot of the requirements and risk assumed to be my responsibility for me as a sole self-employed person. It goes from a lot of that is not required, and it's up to me, and I can make a good living. Let's say double the equivalent wage that I could get being employed by anybody else, because once you like, I can't expand as a self-employed person and start hiring people without it suddenly getting very complicated. And the end result is that the equivalent wage at which I can get a job of the exact type, say landscaping, compared to what I could make being self-employed doing the exact same thing is like half. Like
There might be programs that offer things like business plan help, mentoring, or even financial assistance to get you started. You could look into the website for your local council, or maybe a business association for self-employed tradies could help you out.
no, this is all theoretical. I guess what I'm saying is, there should be somewhere in between going and working for a large company and having all the workers' protections and, of course, all the requirements for licensing, occupational licensing and ticketing, which is kind of burdensome, I believe. And then, being self-employed as a sole trader and not having, being able to bypass all of that and make a really good living. Somewhere in between that, if you start off self-employed and you need to hire a couple of people, surely there should be a way for people like that without all the required ticketing, simple thing to sign a thing saying, I am not, I'm not a qualified blah blah blah. I don't have a license
Yeah,
and
I
blah
can
blah
see
blah.
your point.
Yeah.
So it sounds like there's a disconnect between the practical skills you have and the paperwork you need to prove it.
Well, in terms of being able to actually employ somebody, and within yes, massively. You can do a lot of things in Australia as a self-employed person, and when you start hiring people, a lot of people do it anyway, and they just hire people they know aren't gonna stick their hand in a bloody lawnmower blade. But if you hire people and do that, and the people aren't fully qualified or have and something does go wrong, they can just go onto Facebook and find a dodgy lawyer to shift all the blame back on whoever employed them. And the regulatory framework is so what's the word, so skewed in terms of crazy safety and regulation that you know the the end result is that you know it's quite risky to hire anybody without a hell of a lot of costly liability and making sure those people have a whole lot of often unnecessary qualifications to cover your butt, so to speak.
Yeah, I can see how the focus on safety and regulation can make it really hard to take on employees. It sounds like the system could be more supportive of small business owners who want to grow their team. Do you think there's a way to simplify the process without sacrificing too much safety?
I absolutely do think there is, but even if you can't sacrifice, even if you can't get your cake and eat it, so to speak, there's a certain level of risk involved in a lot of jobs that automatically pays higher just because it's risky. I mean, this is well known. A lot of people, a lot of feminists, who don't do risky manual labor, they sort of go, why is there this wage gap? And the truth is because men are more willing to do risky work, and it doesn't matter how much of this safety regulation you have. At the end of the day, is you will get paid more for a higher risk. So my argument is, well, if the risk is going to be there regardless, then people should be allowed to voluntarily take on more risk, sign away, I don't know, liability to the government to a degree to get paid more if they don't have, if they aren't seen to have every little bit of qualification. And you could have and when I say qualifications, I mean, like, if the only person who's going to have increased risk and liability for this kind of work is basically you and your safety, then you should be able to say, well, I'm competent and more skilled, and I choose to take on that extra risk in return for more money. And this happens anyway. It's just I'm saying let's make it formal, And there's certain lack of qualifications and risk that you don't want people going into without experience and so forth, that might put other people at risk or safety. But I think this could be easily stripped apart, and really we should acknowledge the fact that dirty hard work with inherent risk is going to pay more anyway. And people that whinge about that, who have extremely low risk jobs in offices, they would probably better appreciate the existing market driven extra pay that these people get.
Yeah, right now the market's the main driver of wages. If a job's risky, dirty, or unpleasant, you generally get paid more because not many people want to do it. But if the same job was safer with less red tape, would that higher pay rate need to be there? It'd be interesting to look at studies that compare similar jobs with different safety regulations and see if the pay rates change.
Exactly. And let's be frank too, there's a lot of manufacturing production in the West now that is outsourced, so that we have plug and play disposable goods at our leisure, where our working class wouldn't want to be under those conditions, which I agree with. But we also within our own working class, I think, have become so risk adverse, perverse that this is going a little bit too far. I mean, and the bigger debate on why certain people get paid more money, and whether that's being is favoring men over women. Well, that argument again, if you just acknowledged the fact that you can't legislate and nanny state risk out of everything, therefore some jobs are going to inherently be dirtier and more dangerous, and people who choose to do that are going to get paid more. I mean, that's exactly what's happening, and the fact that people are debating it and calling it a lack of pay equality among the genders, to me, is absurd.
It's easy to see why people might feel frustrated about that. It seems like we're constantly debating the fairness of different jobs instead of just acknowledging the reality of the situation. Some jobs are naturally going to be less desirable than others. And to be honest, it does feel like there's this push to try and make every job the same, in terms of risk and reward, when that's just not how the real world works.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I mean, a lot of the drivers of automation and a lot of fields of work are coming from the private sector, and the traditional left-wing working class people will point to that, but they also don't sort of acknowledge the fact that their own side of politics, which love regulation and over-regulation and public servants whose existence requires this kind of regulation. Well, those people are forcing automation or at least outsourcing of a lot of jobs, just because of the never what's the word never compromising fantasy that all risk will be regulated out of work. The reality is that for them to be for that to be satisfied, the easiest answer is to automate a lot of jobs, and that's not being acknowledged. A lot of the overregulation, left wing leaning people, they will always blame the efficiencies of the private sector trying to automate things, but they won't blame the fact that their own regulation is also forcing automation, because they're not allowing people to take higher risks, get paid higher for dirty jobs with inherent danger.
It's really interesting how regulation can have unintended consequences, like driving automation. And that raises an important question about how we manage this. It seems like we need a way for businesses to have that flexibility to innovate, but without putting workers at a serious disadvantage.
Exactly, they absolutely do. And to be fair, there's a lot of people who, would who excel, doing innovative, risky work, and if they could be formally allowed to do so, and take some of that, I don't know, liability on themselves, not only will they be rewarded financially, but they will be in a job, which is providing more overall sort of innovation and progress. And I think that's how it should be. I think that there should be, jobs for people who are, don't want to take high risk, and that, within high regulatory framework, but jobs that inherently have more risk at the moment, they're not actually being acknowledged for it, even now within.
I understand what you're saying. That's absolutely right. The current system doesn't explicitly acknowledge the value of risk-taking in many jobs. It's almost like there's an expectation that anyone should be able to do any job, regardless of the challenges involved. Do you think that a shift towards acknowledging and even rewarding risk could have positive impacts beyond just motivating individuals?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of jobs at the moment, in the public service that are treated the same in terms of their value to society, or lack of the amount they're paid, and I just could see that they're plainly not the same. For example, regular everyday nurses, they operate within a collectivist group environment with a lot of regulation, and steps and balances, and that's completely different to, say, paramedics who go into a uncontrolled environment regularly, spur of the moment, and have to apply skills according to this framework in a way that they should be paid a hell of a lot more, because no matter what you try to do, that's always going to be inherently higher risk. And people campaigning for extra pay for these public servants don't make the distinction. Well, I'd say no. Paramedics aren't even in the same league as nurses. They do longer hours in a higher risk environment. Their skills are tested all the time on the fly, with a lot of inherent room for error. And we pay them roughly the same as nurses who don't have even 1/10 of that burden.
I hear what you're saying, and I agree that paramedics operate in a much more unpredictable and fast-paced environment than nurses. It's a role that demands a unique set of skills and the ability to think on your feet under immense pressure. And while nurses are absolutely crucial to healthcare, it seems fair that those extra responsibilities should come with some additional compensation.
Exactly. Or I could use a less, let's say, I don't know, culturally controversial issue is bus drivers. I mean, we have incredible paranoia and fear around the safety of our children, to the point where I believe it's illegal now in Queensland to allow your children to walk from home to the bus stop and get on a public bus to go to school without supervision. Yet we let our children get on a bus with a guy who's not paid very much, often without seatbelts. And this guy's driving around every day, in the streets. Just statistically speaking, that if you do that kind of job on a low pay for long enough, an accident's going to happen. And we just assume that bus drivers aren't going to have those accidents, and we wouldn't tolerate the kind of level of statistical accidents that I kind of see as sort of being inevitable. It's remarkable that more buses aren't having more accidents, just statistically speaking. And bus drivers aren't paid that much, and the risk and responsibility of their job with our children isn't really acknowledged in any way. You know,
That's a very valid point. Given the responsibility and potential consequences involved, it's surprising that bus drivers aren't compensated and supported more. It seems like a situation where the current system isn't aligned with the reality of the job. Would you like to discuss ways to improve the situation for bus drivers and other workers in similar roles?
not really, because any of the ways that I would suggest to improve it involve people individually bargaining, and a lot of these jobs to be separated from each other in terms of collective bargaining, which Australia isn't quite ready to have that conversation yet.
That's fair. The current system in Australia doesn't seem to favour individual bargaining when it comes to these types of jobs. It makes me think we should look into the pros and cons of a more individualised approach, and maybe even discuss how something like that could work in practice.
Well, yeah. Look, there's certain sacred cows of the left wing in Australia, and this type of thing is one of those. And yeah, I don't see it changing anytime soon. The obvious answer is to pay everyone more, but governments have proven lately to basically be as inefficient as possible and to blame everything on the private sector.
It's frustrating to see the disconnect between the reality of certain jobs and the way they're valued and compensated. The current system seems to be more about maintaining the status quo than actually recognizing what these jobs are worth. But the question then becomes how we shift that perspective. Because right now, the idea of paying people based on the inherent risks of their job is seen as controversial.
Well, yeah, and but the thing is, it shouldn't be. And a lot of people whinging about equality of pay, especially to do with men and women. They seem to point to the wage gap as being some evidence of patriarchy existing, in favouring men, when in reality, it doesn't take a lot of analysis to realise that a lot of these jobs are paying more because they are higher risk, and that's just not being acknowledged by the system because, well, it can't acknowledge it.
I understand what you're saying. Acknowledging that some jobs are inherently riskier than others would be a step in the right direction, but we also need to talk about the underlying factors that lead to women being concentrated in lower paying jobs. You mentioned that we should focus on the specific jobs and not get distracted by gender differences, but I think it's important to look at both. Can we delve deeper into why these job differences exist?
Not right now. I'll leave it there.
No worries. Let's stay focused on the idea of acknowledging risk in different jobs.
Okay, bye.